Good evening and welcome to this evening's pre-concert talk, Highways and Byways of the Piano Trio. Tonight's concert we're going to hear Haydn's Piano Trio in E from 1797, Mendelssohn's Trio No. 2 in C minor from 1845, and Tchaikovsky's Trio in A minor from 1882, so around a century of piano trios. You can download images that go with tonight's talk from the Conway Hall website. The piano trio is a rather intriguing genre. There's no particular reason why violin, piano, and cello should play such a significant role in chamber music. So tonight, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the development of the genre, and then briefly talk about each work in the programme. It first develops out of Baroque chamber music. Then, Haydn plays a significant role in creating the piano trio genre as we know it. It's not until Mozart that somebody adds an extra string instrument and creates a piano quartet. And it's not until the 19th century that composers would regularly write piano quartets and piano quintets. But throughout all of this, people wrote piano trios, including some surprisingly romantic composers. But first, back to the beginning. The Baroque Trio Sonata. Really, this is a related ancestor, but it's important. Two melody instruments, a keyboard playing figured bass, and a cello doubling the bass line. An important point to remember is the keyboard and the bass instrument aren't equal to the melody. They're just filling in the harmony. And the Trio Sonata would give rise to Bach's instrumental sonatas, such as the violin sonatas. Here, Bach fully writes out the keyboard part because, effectively, it's a complete trio sonata with the keyboard holding two parts together. Then we have a rather intriguing development, the Accompanied Sonata. In 1734, the French violinist and composer Jean-Joseph de Mondeville produced his Sonatas for Harpsichord with Violin. And this was taken up by Rameau. In 1741, he writes his Pièce de clavecin en concert, which is for a keyboard with optional accompaniment of violin and viol. So, ad libitum scoring, keyboard and optional extras. The balance has shifted to the interest being in the keyboard, the instrument's subsidiary. And for much of the 18th century, we have this genre of the accompanied sonata, instruments playing along with the keyboard. The Newcastle-based composer Charles Avison would say, "The accompanying violins, which are intended to enforce the expression of the harpsichord, should always be kept subservient to it, for thus an effect results from the whole, as from the sound of one improved or multiplied instrument." German composers took up the idea, and they usually had the cello playing along in the bass line. The violin could be a bit independent of the keyboard, the cello never. Even Bach's son, C.P. Bach, got onto it. In 1775, he writes, "Finally had to bow to fashion and write sonatas for keyboard that are easy, and that one can simply play alone without missing anything." Vienna was somewhat isolated from these developments, partly through politics, and foreign publications weren't available there until the 1770s. The duo sonata was virtually unknown, and they always had a cello playing along on the bass line. Haydn's early trios reflect this style. But the relationship between the violin and the keyboard can be fruitfully exploited in dialogue, though the cellos rarely get the chance to shine. And the formal and tonal schemes are boldly imaginative, making the works well worth listening to. But they're all intended for domestic music making. The piano parts are never too challenging. From a Viennese newspaper in 1789, "Wanted by a nobleman, a servant who plays the violin well and is able to accompany difficult piano sonatas." I think we can take that difficult with a pinch of salt. a tantalising glimpse into a vanished world of domestic music making. Pianos replace harpsichords and become popular domestic instruments. Ladies and gentlemen eagerly acquire the latest published music. And this demand is a very big influence on how the piano trio develops. Haydn, marooned for a large part of his career in Esterházy serving Prince Esterházy, made his European reputation not by performing, but by having his music being published and be popular. And besides Haydn, composers who supplied these trios are now rather little known. Johann Schubert, Charles Avison, Ignaz Pleyel, Daniel Steibelt. So Haydn's early piano trios are very much accompanied sonatas, but the quality and inventiveness of his writing makes them well worth listening to. And Charles Rosen would say, by having the violin and cello doubling the piano, this liberated Haydn from the limitations of the piano playing of the period, so that there's a greater sense of improvisation in these piano trios than there is in his solo piano works. It's the arrival of virtuosos like Mozart, combined with the development of the forte piano itself, that changes the balance in the trio. The forte piano has a stronger range of dynamics and better articulation and a capacity for lyrical playing than the harpsichord. So it becomes more common to develop challenging piano parts. Mozart's 6 violin sonatas, just for violin and keyboard, no extra bass instrument, were published in 1781, and these provide a qualitative leap in the genre. The brilliance of the keyboard writing combines with the full integration of the violin into the texture, and this would carry over into Mozart's piano trios from 1786 and 1788. In these, even the cello is sporadically independent from the piano, and would point to the eventual freedom completely in the works of Beethoven. So Mozart's early trio in B-flat K254 is effectively an accompanied sonata. The strings just follow along. But by contrast, the string parts in the trios K542 from 1788 have a real measure of independence. And by 1789, a reviewer could say of Haydn's trios from that year that they were judged too difficult for sight reading. And Haydn's London trios, inspired by the professional players that he met in London in the 1790s, would go even further. Following the death of his employer, Prince Esterházy, in 1791, and the disbanding of the prince's musical establishment by his successor, Haydn was free to accept other invitations. So, at the invitation of Johann Peter Salomon, the impresario, Haydn went to London to play in Salomon's concert series. And in London, Haydn would give lessons to Rebecca Schroeter. She was the widow of a German composer who lived in London, Johann Samuel Schroeter. The relationship between Schroeter and Haydn was intimate. She wrote, "No language can express half the love and affection I feel for you. You are dearer to me every day of my life." Haydn kept her letters into old age, admitting, "A beautiful and lovable woman. I would readily have married her if I had been free." Haydn, a warm and passionate man, was locked into what seems to have been a loveless marriage for 30 years. It was during his second visit to London that Haydn dedicated a group of trios to Rebecca Schroeter. These include his most well-known trio, the Gypsy Rondo, so called because the rondo finale is in Hungarian gypsy style. It's clear that Schroeter was no mean pianist, judging by the piano parts of these trios, though she gave no public concerts. Women just didn't. A further 3 trios by Haydn were dedicated to another woman he met in England, the pianist Teresa Bartolozzi. She was born in 1770 and would die in 1843. A German, born Teresa Janssen. She moved to London as a girl and would study with Muzio Clementi, the great pedagogue. She gave few public concerts and performed privately, but she developed a strong reputation. So much so that Salomon the impresario gave her and her family free tickets to Haydn's first London series in 1791. Haydn dedicated a group of trios to her in 1797 after he'd returned back to Vienna. And they're inspired not just by her playing, but by the virtuosity of those London instrumentalists. These are not trios for amateurs, and it's one of those that we're hearing tonight, the trio in E. It's in 3 movements: allegro moderato, allegretto, and allegro. The young Ludwig van Beethoven came from Bonn, where he was born, in the 1790s to study with Haydn. The relationship between the two was tricky, but Beethoven produced his Opus 1 in 1795. Now, it wasn't his first published work, but it was his first substantial one, and these were piano trios. It was a canny move. For a start, if they were popular, there would be plenty of sales. Also, he was making a name for himself as a keyboard player, so a piano trio gives him a starring role in his own instrument. And whilst Mozart and Haydn were mainly associated with string quartets and symphonies, their names were less associated with the piano trio, so he wouldn't seem to be competing as much. Still, the young man laboured long. We can hear nowadays the influence of Haydn and Mozart in them, but when Haydn first heard the piano trios live, he had misgivings. And I'm sure contemporary listeners, it would seem to them that these trios were a headlong assault on the domestic genre of the piano trio. By 1809, when Beethoven wrote his piano trios Opus 70, he had developed the genre. These 2 trios, which include the Ghost, were a present for an aristocratic friend who had let Beethoven stay there for the summer. Here, in these trios, he completely emancipates the 2-string instruments. We have 3 independent parts in vivid discourse with a kaleidoscope of textures. Beethoven would write one more multi-movement piano trio, the trio in B-flat, Opus 97, which was written in 1811, and this is known by its nickname, the Archduke, because it was dedicated to Archduke Rudolph of Austria. He was the youngest of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II's 12 children, so he was well away from the throne. He was an amateur pianist. He was a patron, a friend, and a composition student of Beethoven's. Beethoven would dedicate 14 compositions to the Archduke, and the Archduke would dedicate one of his to Beethoven. With the Archduke trio, the genre comes into its own. It leaves domesticity far behind because Beethoven writes a magisterial 4-movement work lasting a whopping 40 minutes. And this would carry over into the writing of Beethoven's young contemporary, Schubert. Schubert writes 2 complete trios. There are 2 stray movements as well. And these trios date from late in his career, 1827 and 1828, the year of his death. Both complete trios are large scale, each in 4 movements, and the second lasts 50 minutes. And like Beethoven, Schubert produces a discourse for 3 independent instruments. But during the 19th century, there are significant technical developments in the piano, and you have composer virtuosos like Chopin and Hummel, who favoured brilliant piano writing in the trios, so things are changing. Felix Mendelssohn wrote 3 piano trios. The first one, without a number, in 1820, when he was all of 11. His trio number 1 dates from 1839, where he's an old man of 20, and trio number 2, the one we're going to hear tonight, dates from 1845. Mendelssohn was a distinguished pianist. He also wrote 4 piano quartets and a piano sextet, and he would play all of them in concert. For trio number 1, he substantially rewrote the piano part, making it more modern, more Schumannesque, at the behest of his friend, the composer Ferdinand Hiller. And this trio would become one of Mendelssohn's most popular works. The Trio No. 2 in C minor, Opus 66, which we hear tonight, is dedicated to the composer Louis Spohr, who was actually present at the premiere of Beethoven's Archduke Trio. Mendelssohn would write to Spohr for the dedication, "I would like to have saved the honour for a somewhat longer piece, but then I should have had to put it off, as I have so often of late. Nothing seemed to be good enough to me. In fact, neither does this trio," which seems a slightly offhand way of dedicating a work to a friend. This trio does not wear its heart on its sleeve as much as Trio No. 1. So, though it's his final work, it's not as popular. It's in 4 movements: Allegro energico e fuoco, Andante espressivo, Scherzo, which is molto allegro, quasi presto, and the finale, Allegretto appassionato. Mendelssohn wrote virtuoso piano parts, and this has led generations of pianists to turn them into mini piano concertos and encourage critics to view the writing as unbalanced and overloaded. But Mendelssohn knew what he was doing, and when performed by real chamber musicians, they reveal the trios as being works of sparkling transparency. Mendelssohn's friend and colleague Schumann initially concentrated just on piano music. He only started writing songs in 1840, the year he was aged 30, but that was also the year he got married. And he wrote hundreds of songs throughout that year. Then, apart from an early work, he wrote no chamber music till 1842. But in 1842, Schumann would write a piano quartet, a piano quintet, 3 string quartets, and the Fantasiestücke for piano trio. He was one of the first composers to pair the piano with the popular string quartet, thus creating a piano quintet. His 3 formal piano trios date from 1847 and 1851. He was a trained pianist. He'd intended to have a concert career, but injury put paid to that. And his piano trios can seem something of an extension of his own piano music. Still, the string writing is very inventive. His wife Clara was also a composer. Though Robert encouraged her, she had to balance being a composer with being a wife, a mother, and a touring virtuoso who was often the main breadwinner in the family. She did write a piano trio in 1846. Rather significantly, it was before any of Robert's formal piano trios. It's a large-scale piece and regarded as her masterpiece. Throughout the 19th century, the imbalance that I mentioned develops. There's a change in musical vocabulary, and the technical developments in the piano aren't balanced by technical developments in string instruments, so the piano comes to dominate. Some composers, even Brahms in his 2 mature works, seem to be striving for effects that would be better achieved with a larger body of strings. Brahms would write just 3 piano trios. The first in 1854 when he was 21, the second in 1880, and the third in 1886. But he destroyed a lot as well. He was never quite satisfied. And in fact, in 1889, he revised his first piano trio, and he revised it so heavily that many commentators regard it as an entirely new work. In parallel to this, over in France, a very strong piano trio tradition develops. César Franck would write 5 piano trios. He was born in Belgium but spent most of his musical career in Paris. His piano trios are early works, 1839 to 1840. They're the work of an earnest, rather serious young man for whom chamber music was important. It's worth bearing in mind that these are just 12 years after Beethoven's death. Franck's pupils, Chausson and Dandy, would write piano trios. Dandy is an interesting point. He wrote his first one in 1887, and being long-lived, he wrote his second one in 1929. Other French composers also did so. Lalo, Saint-Saëns. And it's with Fauré, Debussy and Ravel that the chronology becomes rather mixed up. First, Debussy writes a very early one in 1880. Then Ravel follows in 1914, and only then does their older contemporary Fauré write one, very late in his career in 1922 at the age of 77. But tonight, we're going off to Russia. Mikhail Glinka, 1804 to 1857, is generally regarded as the father of Russian music, the first composer to write Russian music rather than emulating Western models. He did write chamber music, including a fine viola sonata, but appears to have written no piano trio, except in Russia, his trio for piano and wind instruments was well known in a version for piano and strings. Following Glinka's death, a circle of nationalist composers grew up round Mili Balakarev, 1837 to 1910. These are known as the Five, or the Mighty Handful. César Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Alexander Borodin. They avoided absolute music. Music was about something. Program music in orchestral music, opera, song. It was only Borodin, 1833 to 1887, whose wife happens to be a pianist, who wrote a substantial amount of chamber music. 2 quartets, a piano trio, and a piano quintet. But when Borodin started work on his first quartet, the others in the group were very dissatisfied. They didn't like it at all. Balakarev had little formal harmony and counterpoint, and he developed no empirical system. But he encouraged the composers of the Five to develop a school of composition in Russia which was free of southern and southwestern European influence. By contrast, the young Tchaikovsky studied at the new St. Petersburg Conservatory, where the biggest influence was the composer and pianist Anton Rubinstein, 1829 to 1894, and his brother, the pianist Nikolai Rubinstein, 1835 to 1881. Both brothers had travelled extensively in Europe and had been supported by Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer and encouraged by them. Nikolai was regarded as the greatest pianist of his day and would become a close friend of Tchaikovsky's. Anton writes 5 piano trios. 2 are very early. Most of them date from the years as a touring virtuoso, and they're written in emulation of his German musical icons, so Mendelssohn figures large. Rather interestingly, for some of the piano trios, we can find no record of Anton himself actually playing them, and I'm not sure at all whether Nikolai ever played any of his brother's piano trios. So Tchaikovsky, unlike the Five, was academically trained. He wanted to write music which would stand up to Western scrutiny, would transcend national barriers, and yet be distinctly Russian in its melody and rhythm. So whilst he did use folk songs, he tried to follow Western practices of composition, particularly with regard to tonality and tonal progression. But Balakarev would continue to attack St. Petersburg Conservatoire and Anton Rubinstein. Anton, who wrote music in a rather classical style, was similarly critical of the nationalist composers, though Nikolai Rubinstein was more supportive of them. As a young man, Tchaikovsky was supported by Nadezhda von Meck. She was the widow of a railway magnate. She would become an important friend, confidant, emotional support, and patroness of the composer. But they never ever met. She was highly cultured, very well off, and withdrew from society when her husband died. She would employ the 18-year-old Claude Debussy to teach her daughters music. She supported Nikolai Rubinstein, and it was in 1877 that Rubinstein recommended Tchaikovsky to von Meck. She commissioned music from Tchaikovsky and would eventually give him an allowance. They had a strong relationship by letter until 1890, and then in that year, von Meck terminated the relationship by letter. At the time, she was ill and under great family pressure to stop the relationship with Tchaikovsky. Nikolai Rubinstein would become a great supporter of Tchaikovsky's, playing the first piano concerto, which Tchaikovsky wrote in 1877, and being the dedicatee of the second concerto in 1880. And it was in 1880 that von Meck asks Tchaikovsky for a piano trio. His response in a letter: "You ask why I have never written a trio. Forgive me, dear friend. I would do anything to give you pleasure, but this is beyond me. I simply cannot endure the combination of piano with violin or cello. To my mind, the timbre of these instruments will not blend. It is torture for me to have to listen to a string trio or a sonata of any kind for piano and strings. To my mind, the piano can only be effective in 3 situations: alone, in context with the orchestra, or as accompaniment, i.e. the background of a picture." Yet, a year later, with no prompting, he starts work on a piano trio. It's written in response to the death of Nikolai Rubinstein in 1880 and is dedicated to his memory. Writing to von Meck in December 1881 and referring to his antipathy for this combination of instruments, Tchaikovsky would say, "In spite of this antipathy, I am thinking of experimenting with this sort of music, which so far I have not touched. I have already written the start of a trio. Whether I shall finish it and whether it will come out successfully, I do not know. But I would like very much to bring what I have begun to a successful conclusion. I will not hide from you the great effort of will required to set down my musical ideas in this new and unusual form, but I shall overcome these difficulties." It was Tchaikovsky's only work for piano trio and is arguably his most difficult work for piano. So, we have letters from Tchaikovsky to von Meck about the genesis of the work and about its dedication to Nikolai Rubinstein, but he never explains why he's dedicating a piano trio to Nikolai Rubinstein. The trio was written whilst Tchaikovsky was in Rome in 1881 and 82. There was a private performance in March 1882 at Moscow Conservatory. Sergei Taneyev was on piano, Jan Hujimali was on violin, and Wilhelm Fitzenhagen was on cello, and it was performed on the first anniversary of Nikolai Rubinstein's death. The work then underwent substantial revision, with input from the performers. The revised version was given its first public performance in October 1882. The performers all had links to Tchaikovsky. Wilhelm Fitzenhagen was the dedicatee of Tchaikovsky's Rococo Variations, which he premiered in 1877, except that Fitzenhagen premiered his own radical revision of the variations, and it's only been in the 21st century that Tchaikovsky's original has been performed regularly in the West. Fitzenhagen was also in the premieres of Tchaikovsky's string quartets, where the quartet was led by Jan Hujimali. Sergei Taneyev, who was a pianist and composer, had studied both with Tchaikovsky and with Nikolai Rubinstein. Taneyev and Tchaikovsky would have a close musical friendship. The piano trio is in just 2 movements. They are both very substantial. And the second is so large, it's almost in 2 movements. The first movement, pezzo elegiaco, is moderato assai and then allegro giusto. And the second, tema con variazione, theme and variations, is andante con moto. But then there's a variazione finale and coda, the substantial second part. Well, that's the end of the talk. Many thanks for tuning in, and please do think about supporting Conway Hall's appeal, and I hope that you enjoy the concert. Thank you.